Welcome to Ground Control. We are reviewing the Volantex Ranger G2. It's a 1.2 meter wingspan airplane that's designed for FPV flight. I've already tried to maiden this plane once, and I had to do a little repair to the nose. I cracked the foam underneath the nose where they've got the cutout for a camera. And one of the problems with this plane, I think the reason that it wasn't a successful maiden flight, is I had the elevator in a neutral position, and if you look at the motor, there's a little bit of an angle, and when you have a motor on a pylon like this, you need an angle on the motor so that the thrust angle goes through the center of gravity. The center of gravity on this plane, the published center of gravity, is 77 millimeters from the leading edge of the wing where it attaches to the fuselage, plus or minus 5 millimeters. So if I take this zip tie right here and I line it up, I line it up with the motor shaft, look where the thrust angle is. The thrust angle is forward of the center of gravity. So when you throttle that motor up, what it wants to do is it wants to push the nose down. And that's exactly what happened to me. First I tried taking off from the ground, and it's pretty rough where I have to take off. But when you throttle up to get this plane rolling on the ground, because the thrust angle is forward of the CG point, it wants to lift the tail up off of the ground. And which is exactly what it would do to me. Every time I would try to gain a little speed to be able to take off from the ground, it would lift the tail up and the plane would just spin around. So they really should have had enough angle, either had enough angle on this pylon to put that thrust angle through the center of gravity so it's not pushing the nose or the tail, or they should have extended this pylon with the current angle that they have. And the further back you put this motor, then the more shallow angle you need in order to hit that CG mark. So that's a design flaw in this plane, for sure. So I couldn't take off from the ground, so I decided I would do a hand launch. So I throttled up about 70% throttle, launched it, and it nosed down into the ground like I had pushed the stick all the way forward. You know, for the elevator control. I mean, it was that abrupt. So they have two independent servos, one servo for each one of the ailerons. So what I did to hopefully mitigate some of this issue with the improper thrust angle is I removed the Y cable that they had for these two servos. I put two servo extension cables in, two servo extension cables in, and tied those into two separate channels on my receiver, and I programmed Flaperons. So when I go out and maiden it this time, this is going to be my remaiden. When I go out and remaiden it this time, I will have full flaps engaged, and I'm also going to have some upward trim on the elevator to try and counteract this improper thrust angle where it wants to force the nose down. So I don't like that one bit. I mean, if I was designing a plane like this, I would certainly make sure I had the thrust angle where it was going through the CG point. So Volantex is, you know, sometimes I have, let me see, I have three of their planes. And the two that I have the Super Cub, and I have the Volantex Mini Train Star, which I think is the best micro trainer plane I've come across, and I like the Super Cub as well. But this really is it's pretty annoying to have that thrust angle that way, where it just it pushes the nose down. I don't think you'd be able to take off of the ground with this plane unless you're on a fairly smooth surface like asphalt or concrete. You certainly wouldn't be able to take off in grass, and you certainly wouldn't be able to take off in hard-packed, sandy, pebbly soil like I have to take off from. So I'm not real happy with that. But we're going to go out, and we're going to try to remaiden this plane, and then I'll give you my final thoughts on it after I get it in the air and test it out a little bit and see how well it responds to control. So I will see you out at the field.
I was just going to say it even sounds slow.
Yeah, I've still got flaps today. You can play it pretty slow with flaps engaged. We can land it without tipping it over.
Hey, that was pretty good though.
Okay, so the remaiden was successful, but I had to, make a modification in order to do that. I'm really disappointed that Volantex did not get the thrust angle on that motor correct. If they had, I wouldn't have nosed it in on the initial flight, the initial launch. But what saved me from that, what mitigated that issue was using two Servo Extension Cables to tie the separate Aileron Servos into two different channels on the receiver and put in Flaperons. And I had full flap deflection when I launched this plane on the remaiden. I had full up trim on the elevator when I launched it on the remaiden. And as you could see, it took off pretty well. I had about 60% throttle when I launched it, and it didn't lose much altitude, and it certainly didn't nose down on me on this launch. And I think that is specifically because of full flap deflection and full up trim on the elevator. Now, once I got up to speed, of course it wanted to climb, so I had to take the trim back out of the elevator, and then it was fine. And I was cruising around with it, and it seemed fairly smooth, it seemed fairly stable. I did have to put a little bit of left trim into the rudder. It wanted to drift a little bit to the right. Even going into a crosswind, it was doing that. So I put in a little bit of left rudder, and it tracked pretty well after that. this plane, this type of plane is new territory for me. I mean, I'm used to flying mini and micro planes. I'm still a beginner when it comes to line of sight flight. I don't have any problem flying just about anything FPV. But flying line of sight, this is completely new territory for me. It is definitely a cruiser. It is, you know, after flying park jets and then flying this is definitely not a sport plane. And it says that it's a, you know, cruiser or trainer, FPV cruiser or trainer. I would not call this plane a trainer, and I wouldn't recommend it as a trainer plane, specifically because it takes some modification to get it to fly correctly to begin with. And what I look at when a trainer plane should be a plane that's ready to go. You know, all a new pilot should have to do is situate his battery so that he has the center of gravity correct on that plane. Shouldn't have to, reprogram the ailerons to have flaps. He shouldn't have to have, full elevator deflection just to be able to launch it and not have it nose down on him. The other thing that I did, here's I think a good tip for you. When you have the battery in the front of this plane and you have it centered on the center of gravity, when you give it some throttle, it wants to bring the tail up. And you could see my first attempt, I tried to take off from the ground, and this plane was just not going to take off in the rough stuff. But one thing I did last night before I went out was I took the landing gear off of the plane. I don't know if you can tell this in the camera, if you can see the angle that I put into the landing gear on the plane. I took the landing gear off. I took a pair of pliers. I went about halfway down the strut, and I bent the strut forward at an angle. And then I had to, of course, bend the wheels back out. So then I took the pliers and grabbed the end of the strut where the axle comes out, and I bent the wheel back around. But what that did for this plane was it pushed the front wheels about 1.5 inches forward of where they were, and so it keeps this motor from lifting this tail up as much. And when you saw when I came in for a landing, I mean it was kind of a rough landing when I came in. If I hadn't bent those wheel struts forward so that the front wheels were further forward on the airframe, this thing would have just nosed over as soon as I touched the ground. So that's something that I would say you definitely want to do. You want to modify those struts. You want to bend those struts forward and get those front wheels at least 1 inch to 1.5 inches further forward on this airframe. And then I think you'll be able to take off without any problem on a smooth surface without this motor lifting this tail up on you, and it'll make it easier to come in and land without the tail coming up on you. So there you go. I would recommend this. If you want to make the changes that I made, after that it launched fine. I didn't have a problem. I did have to take the trim out of the elevator once I got up to speed. It flew fairly well, and with the flaps engaged, you could see just how slow you could fly. You could fly it fairly slow. So for an FPV cruiser with those modifications, I think it makes a pretty decent FPV cruiser. It's a shame that those modifications have to be made to get this plane where it needs to be. I would not recommend it as a trainer. They also call it a trainer. No, it's not a trainer. I might recommend this as your third plane if you're new to planes. But no, I would not buy this plane as a trainer. I would not recommend it as a trainer. Hopefully in the future they will get that thrust line correct for these planes to make it a lot easier without having to make these modifications. So I will be taking it out in the future and cruising around with it and practice flying a much larger plane than what I'm used to flying, and maybe see if we could do basic acro with it. I don't know. We'll see. But maybe some slow, lazy loops and some rolls we'll be able to perform with it. But there you go. That's my recommendation on this plane. Those are the modifications that I would definitely make to this plane before I took it out to fly. You don't want to nose it in like I did on the first launch. And there's a good chance that you will without these modifications. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Please give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe Don't forget to check out our Patreon site. We have a lot of free content there as well. And I will see you in the air.